Welcome to the pod-key summary of lead poisoning. Today's roundup is about lead, which is one of those old hazards that never really stayed in the past. The big picture is pretty stark. There's no known safe exposure threshold. The damage can start at very low levels, and the burden falls hardest on children and poorer communities. And the story isn't just toxicology. It reaches into housing, work, food, water, public health funding, even wildlife, and a very long human history of leaving lead behind us. One of the most important things to understand here is that lead can harm children even below blood lead levels that used to be treated as the main cutoff. Exposure is associated with reduced IQ, worse attention, memory problems, and lower academic performance. And researchers still haven't found a safe threshold where you can say, below this, no problem. Kids are especially vulnerable because they absorb about 4 to 5 times more ingested lead than adults do. And during brain development, lead can interfere with synapse formation, myelination, and neurotransmission, which sounds technical, but really means it can disrupt how the brain builds and wires itself in lasting ways. There's even MRI evidence from adults who were exposed in childhood showing reduced brain volume, especially in the prefrontal cortex, suggesting the structural effects can still be visible decades later. This is also not some niche environmental issue. In 2021, an estimated 1.5 million deaths were attributed to lead exposure, and around 800 million children in low and middle income countries were estimated to have blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. Lead accounts for about 0.6% of the world's disease burden, but prevention funding has been estimated at roughly 31 cents per healthy life year affected. That's about 600 times less funding than comparable HIV prevention efforts, which gives you a sense of how under-prioritized this is. The exposure is also deeply unequal. Poor communities, families in older housing, urban residents, and people living near smelters or other lead processing sites tend to carry much more of the risk. A tricky part of lead is that it doesn't show up through just one obvious source. It can persist in old paint and household dust, contaminated soil, drinking water pipes, food, ceramics, cosmetics, folk remedies, ammunition, and consumer products. So even though the phase-out of leaded gasoline was a huge public health win, the leftovers are still with us in urban soil and dust. And that phase-out is more recent than a lot of people probably realize. Algeria, the last country to eliminate leaded petrol, did it only in July 2021. There are also these strange, alarming exposure pathways that sound almost unbelievable until you remember how incentives work. In Bangladesh, lead chromate added to turmeric turned out to be a major source of exposure, and after enforcement efforts, blood lead levels among turmeric mill workers fell by a median of 30% by 2021. So yes, sometimes the hazard is in the wall paint, and sometimes it's in the spice jar, which is exactly what makes this so hard to manage. Lead also has this frustrating biological persistence. It moves through blood, soft tissue, and bone, and once it's in bone, the half-life is measured in years to decades. That means exposure doesn't just end when the source disappears. Pregnancy and normal bone remodeling can mobilize stored lead back into the bloodstream later on, so the body can effectively re-expose itself. Mechanistically, lead mimics or displaces essential metals like calcium, iron, and zinc, and it interferes with enzymes involved in heme production, including alate and ferrochelatase. That helps explain why lead is linked not only to neurological injury and impaired development, but also to anemia. And it also explains why treatment is limited. Chelation can lower circulating lead, but it may not undo cognitive damage from lower-level tissue exposure, and blood levels can rebound as lead leaks back out of bone. Another complication is that lead poisoning often doesn't announce itself clearly. Symptoms can be vague or absent, and when they do show up, they can look like a lot of other things. Abdominal pain, constipation, irritability, fatigue, concentration problems, behavioral changes. That can send people down a gastrointestinal, psychiatric, developmental, or neurological workup without anyone first thinking, Could this be lead? The CDC lowered the blood lead reference value for children from 5 to 3.5 micrograms per deciliter in October 2021, which reflects the growing recognition that harm happens at lower levels than older standards assumed. But blood lead mostly tells you about recent or current exposure. Bone measurements can give a better sense of cumulative burden, but routine bone testing just isn't widely available. For adults, workplace exposure is still a major issue in battery recycling, mining, smelting, plumbing, construction, firing ranges, ceramics, and other jobs that involve lead-containing materials. And the danger doesn't stay at work. Lead dust can come home on clothes or skin, exposing children who never set foot in the workplace. That's especially bad for little kids because crawling, hand-to-mouth behavior, and sometimes pica make contaminated floor dust, soil, or paint chips much more direct sources of poisoning. This is why prevention matters so much more than waiting to treat the problem later. The most effective response is source removal. Replacing lead service lines, controlling lead paint and dust, banning lead in products, and improving workplace monitoring. Chelation has a role, but mainly for substantially elevated levels or serious symptoms, using agents like succimer, calcium disodium EDTA, or dimercaprol. It can have adverse effects of its own, and it's not a great answer for chronic low-level exposure. Even some fixes need care. Partial replacement of lead water pipes can temporarily make contamination worse by disturbing what remains, while complete replacement is more reliable but can cost homeowners thousands of dollars. There's also a well-known and very contested theory linking childhood lead exposure to later violent crime. Some analyses found that preschool blood lead trends track crime decades later, and one model attributed 65 to 90% of variation in U.S. violent crime rates to lead exposure. People remember this idea because the timing lines up neatly with the phase-out of leaded gasoline and lead paint before the crime decline of the 1990s. But the evidence is disputed, and critics point out that confounding factors could be doing a lot of work there. What is better supported is that lead exposure is associated with aggression, impulsivity, school suspension, and juvenile detention, even if those correlations do not prove lead alone causes criminal behavior. And the legacy goes beyond people. Waterfowl can ingest spent shot. Scavengers like California condors can die from eating carcasses with lead bullet fragments, and conservation programs have had to capture condors to test and treat them. Some habitats have banned lead ammunition for that reason. What really stays with me is the timescale of all this. Human activity has measurably polluted the atmosphere with lead for about 2,000 years, and a 2025 study linked Roman-era mining and smelting pollution to elevated blood lead levels and cognitive decline during the Pax Romana. So this isn't just a modern regulatory headache. It's a remarkably durable human habit of scattering a neurotoxin around and then discovering, slowly, how much of it comes back to us. That's the roundup for today. Lead is one of those issues where the science is clear on the broad lesson. Preventing exposure early matters far more than trying to clean up the damage later. And for something with such an ancient history, it still feels uncomfortably current. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.